In the stillness, before history began, before the walls of Babylon rose from the plain, and before the first clay tablet was pressed with the wedge-shaped script that would define an age, there was a silence across the Mesopotamian night. It was a silence so complete that even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb it, drifting softly across the great rivers and the plains that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. In that silence, beneath the shimmering glow of the early morning star, the people of Sumer believed a presence watched over them, a presence older than their cities, older than their stories, older even than the idea of heaven itself. They called her Inanna, and later they would call her Ishtar. To them, she was not merely a goddess, but the living pulse of the world, the radiant force that held desire and destruction in perfect balance, the queen of heaven whose will shaped the rhythm of existence. To begin her story, you must imagine a world that feels at once impossibly distant and strangely familiar. The land was young then, carved by floods and sunlight, shaped by the labor of those who built the first temples and laid the foundations of civilization. Across that land, fires flickered in mud-brick homes, priests tended shrines filled with incense, and the first kings sought legitimacy in the eyes of beings who were both feared and adored. Among these divine figures, none shone more brightly or more fiercely than Inanna. She embodied contradictions without apology. She was the bringer of love and the bringer of war, the force that stirred the heart and the force that broke it, the impulse to create and the impulse to destroy. To worship her was to accept that life itself was a cycle of passion and peril. Her earliest devotees gathered in Uruk, a city that rose from the marshes like a miracle. There, within the towering walls and the courtyards filled with the sound of chanting, they built a sanctuary called the House of Heaven. It was not a temple in the ordinary sense. It was a threshold between worlds, a place where mortals believed the divine could descend and walk among them. Priests and priestesses tended the sacred fires, adorned the altars with offerings, and performed rituals meant to honor the goddess, whose beauty was said to be blinding and whose wrath could unmake entire kingdoms. When the star of Venus rose in the sky, they whispered that Inanna was traveling across the heavens, surveying her domain with eyes that saw the hearts of men and gods alike. But Inanna was never a distant or benevolent goddess. She was the embodiment of desire in its most overwhelming form. Stories told around temple fires described her as a figure of irresistible magnetism, one who crossed boundaries without hesitation and who demanded absolute devotion. Her worshippers painted her in images of power, standing atop lions, adorned in jewels, surrounded by symbols of kingship and conquest. She moved through myth like a storm, leaving behind transformations that reshaped the world. Her lovers were blessed beyond measure, yet they risked ruin with every breath. Her enemies feared her not only for her strength, but for her unpredictability, for she was a force that no one, not even the great gods of the sky and the underworld, could fully control. To understand her is to understand the ancient mind, a mind that saw no contradiction in a goddess who was both nurturer and destroyer. The people of Sumer did not divide the world into neat categories of good and evil, light and darkness. They believed that the divine reflected the truth of existence, a truth where beauty and terror were intertwined. Inanna embodied that truth more completely than any other deity. She was radiant and terrifying, compassionate and merciless, seductive and lethal. She was the queen who granted blessings with a smile and unleashed devastation with the same serene certainty. Her mythology is filled with moments of triumph and moments of tragedy, all bound together by the intensity of her relentless will. As we begin this journey, allow the noise of the present to fall away. Let the weight of thousands of years gather around you like a soft cloak. Imagine the flicker of torchlight on temple walls, the chanting of priests calling the goddess's name, and the distant echo of drums that once marked the rhythms of ancient festivals. This world you are stepping into is not symbolic or metaphorical. It was real to those who lived in it, real enough to shape their cities, their politics, their relationships, their fears, and their hopes. Inanna's presence touched everything. She guided kings, inspired poets, comforted lovers, and terrified warriors. Her stories were carved into stone and pressed into clay, surviving the collapse of empires and the erosion of time. And now, across 5 millennia, her voice still calls to us. It calls from the ruins of Uruk, from the shards of broken tablets, from the myths that refused to die even when her temples crumbled. It calls from the star that still rises before dawn, the same star the Sumerians believed was her eternal form. As we move deeper into her story, you will see why she captivated the ancient world, why her myths endured for so long, and why her influence can still be felt like a whisper in the background of human history. And yet what lies ahead will reveal far more than devotion and ritual. It will reveal a goddess who challenged the boundaries between life and death, between mortal and divine, between order and chaos. But before we descend into the depths of her mysteries, you must understand one more thing. Inanna was never content to remain at the edges of myth. She stepped into the heart of human experience with a force that demanded attention, and the moment she appears in a story, everything changes. What happens next will take us into those stories, into the myths that shaped her devotees and defined her legacy. It is there, in the tales of love, rage, conquest, and descent, that the true power of the Queen of Heaven begins to reveal itself. And what you will see in those tales will change everything. To understand the kind of power Inanna possessed, you must travel deeper into the world that gave birth to her. When the sun rose over Sumer, it did not simply illuminate a landscape. It awakened a living network of temples, canals, gardens, and marketplaces, each woven into the rhythms of a civilization that depended not on chance, but on divine balance. And at the center of that balance was Inanna, the shimmering force who bound together the cycles of desire, fertility, storm, warfare, and cosmic order. The people who walked these early streets believed their survival depended on her moods, her journeys, her loves, her griefs. She was not a distant legend, but an active presence, a will that could be felt in the rains that nourished the barley fields and in the storms that tore through them. Every dawn in Uruk began the same way. Priests ascended the temple stairs with offerings of bread, dates, lamb, and sweet beer. They approached the sacred statue of the goddess not as an object of stone, but as a living being who needed to be fed, clothed, and adorned. The statue was washed, anointed with oils, dressed in garments embroidered with gold thread, and crowned with lapis lazuli. These acts were not symbolic gestures. They were obligations. They were the daily work of honoring a goddess whose favor meant the difference between abundance and starvation, peace and despair. The priests believed that through these rituals, they were stabilizing the fabric of the world, creating harmony between heaven and earth. Inanna's reach extended far beyond the walls of her temple. Her influence shaped the agricultural calendar and the social order. She governed the fertile rise of the rivers, which transformed barren soil into thriving farmland. She governed the emergence of new life in the fields, the flocks, and the human settlements. She governed the intensity of desire itself, the spark that drew lovers together and ensured the continuation of families and bloodlines. And just as she brought life, she brought its opposite. She governed the fury of battle, the cries of warriors, the chaos that could swallow cities in a single afternoon. For the Mesopotamians, these dualities were not opposites. They were two faces of the same divine truth embodied in the Queen of Heaven. Among all the myths that shaped the ancient imagination, none captured Inanna's complexity more vividly than her relationship with Dumuzi, the shepherd king. Their love was not a gentle romance, but a force woven into the survival of the land itself. It was sung in poetry and enacted in ritual, turning human intimacy into cosmic renewal. When Inanna loved Dumuzi, crops flourished, flocks multiplied, and prosperity spread across the plains. When she withdrew from him, or when he was taken from her, the world mirrored her grief. Fields shriveled, heat scorched the earth, and life retreated. Their union was cyclical, a rhythm of meeting and parting that defined the seasons. In the mythic cycle, Inanna's descent into the underworld is the turning point that reveals both her audacity and her vulnerability. It is said she chose to descend not from obligation, but from an inner pull toward challenge and transformation. She adorned herself with her finest jewels, her crown, her necklace, her breastplate, each symbolizing an aspect of her power. But at each of the 7 gates of the underworld, these symbols were stripped from her. One by one, she surrendered her authority until she stood naked before her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the dead. The descent was the undoing of a goddess, a deliberate unraveling that mirrored the unraveling of life on earth when she vanished from the world above. Her absence was catastrophic. Without her, the earth withered, desires faded, life stalled. It was only through divine intervention that she was eventually restored to the land of the living. But her return came with a terrible cost. To leave the underworld, someone had to replace her. And when she found Dumuzi sitting comfortably on her throne, adorned in fine clothing rather than mourning her disappearance, her fury sealed his fate. He was taken to the underworld in her place, but in a compromise that reflected the cycles of nature, his sister volunteered to share the burden. Thus the world gained its seasons of growth and decline, tied forever to the rhythm of their alternating journeys. These stories were not merely tales told to entertain. They were the architecture of belief, the explanation for the world's cycles, and the foundation of rituals that shaped Mesopotamian life. In Uruk and beyond, these myths came alive each year in the sacred marriage ceremonies that united the king with Inanna through her high priestess. These rituals were not metaphors. They were believed to renew creation itself, to bind heaven and earth, to ignite the forces that sustained the land and its people. Through them, the king became more than a ruler. He became the consort of the goddess, the vessel through which her life-giving power flowed into the world. But for all her gifts and all her blessings, Inanna was not easily satisfied. Her presence demanded devotion, vigilance, and respect. Her love was potent, her anger devastating. And it was this volatile mixture that would one day lead her to a confrontation unlike any other. A confrontation not with a monster or a demon, but with a mortal king whose defiance would change the fate of heroes. That king was Gilgamesh. And the moment he rejected the Queen of Heaven, the balance that held the ancient world together began to tremble. But the full weight of that rejection and the storm it unleashed is a story that waits just beyond the horizon. To understand the magnitude of what happened next, you must imagine Uruk at the height of its glory, the white temples shimmering beneath the Mesopotamian sun, the broad avenues alive with merchants, artisans, and worshippers, the winds carrying the scent of incense from the house of heaven. This was Inanna's city. Its walls were her pride, its wealth her blessing, its king her chosen instrument. But even a chosen king can defy destiny. Even a queen of heaven can be refused. Gilgamesh, son of the goddess Ninsun and the mortal Lugalbanda, was no ordinary ruler. He walked the boundary between human and divine, a figure carved from the raw stone of ambition and courage. He had confronted monsters, challenged the guardians of forbidden lands, and returned home celebrated as the greatest hero of his age. When he washed himself after battle, when he clothed his body in shining garments, when he placed a jeweled crown upon his head, all eyes in Uruk saw not merely a king, but the embodiment of mortal greatness. And one of those eyes belonged to Inanna. She saw him standing in the courtyard of Uruk, radiant in victory, the blood of Humbaba barely washed from his hands. She felt the pull of desire, not gentle attraction, but a cosmic hunger. the same hunger that had driven her toward Dumuzi, the same hunger that governed storms, birth, war, and the trembling of the earth. The Queen of Heaven descended to make him an offer no mortal had ever refused. She promised him dominion over nations. She promised him divine protection in battle. She promised him prosperity, fertility, renown. She promised him the pleasures of her bed, the union that had renewed kingship for millennia. But Gilgamesh, in a moment that would echo through eternity, said no. No hesitation, no reverence, no fear. He rejected her with brutal clarity, and worse, he listed the names of her former lovers, recounting the tragedies she had brought upon them. The broken bird stripped of its wings, the lion trapped in pits, the shepherd transformed into a wolf, the gardener turned into a frog for declining her advances, and Dumuzi doomed to die again and again. Gilgamesh did not merely refuse her, he exposed her pattern, her wounds, her volatility. He spoke to her as no mortal had dared, and the Queen of Heaven, humiliated in the sight of gods and mortals alike, ascended in fury. The sky trembled, the gates of heaven rattled on their hinges, and before her father Anu, she screamed for vengeance. When Anu hesitated, warning her that unleashing the bull of heaven would bring famine, catastrophe, and death, Inanna issued a threat that froze the divine council. She would break open the gates of the underworld and raise the dead to devour the living, a goddess's wrath becoming apocalypse. Terrified, Anu relented, and so the bull of heaven descended, a beast whose breath split the earth, whose hooves crushed soldiers by the hundreds, whose roar summoned pits of annihilation beneath the feet of men. But Gilgamesh would not kneel. Enkidu would not flee. Together they stood against the divine weapon, clinging to courage as the world shook. Enkidu seized the bull by its horns, holding it firm, and Gilgamesh drove his blade into the monster's heart. A mortal king had slain heaven's wrath. And then, the unforgivable mockery. They hurled the bull's thigh in Inanna's face. In that moment, the fate of heroes was sealed. In the halls of the gods, a sentence was declared. One of the two must die. Not Gilgamesh, whose destiny lay beyond death in a quest that would reshape myth itself, but Enkidu, the brother of his heart, the wild man tamed by friendship, the hero who fought beside him. And as Enkidu's doom unfolded, Gilgamesh would learn the deepest truth of the ancient world. No mortal can defy a goddess without consequence. No king, no warrior, no hero. Even one who conquered monsters could not conquer death. That truth would break him and forge the greatest epic ever written. The death of Enkidu did not come swiftly, like the fall of a warrior on the battlefield. It came slowly, cruelly, with the rhythm of celestial judgment. It began with a fever, a fire that turned his blood against him, a tremor in his limbs that not even the strongest wine could steady. At first, Gilgamesh dismissed it. His friend had survived the terrors of the cedar forest, the grip of Humbaba, the paws of the bull of heaven. How could an invisible illness defeat a man who fought gods and monsters? But the gods had spoken, and their decree is not undone by strength or courage. Enkidu's dreams confirmed the truth. He saw the underworld approaching, not as an idea, but as a place, a land of dust, shadows, and silent judges. He dreamed of being seized by a dark-winged spirit and dragged through a door that no mortal returns from. He saw kings sitting in darkness, eating clay. He saw warriors stripped of glory. He saw priests, nobles, and the lowliest laborers, all wearing the same garments of dust. In the house of the dead, all were equal, and Gilgamesh, the king, the hero, the demigod, could do nothing. He begged the gods. He offered sacrifices. He fell to his knees in temples where he had previously stood tall as a favored son. But Enkidu weakened day by day. His voice faltered. His strength ebbed. His memories flickered like dying firelight. Gilgamesh held him in his arms as the fever took its final claim. He felt the warmth leaving his friend's body, felt the weight settle, felt the universe contract around the unbearable truth. The gods had taken Enkidu, and they would one day take him too. For days, Gilgamesh refused to bury the body. He roamed the palace in grief, calling Enkidu's name, touching his face as if expecting him to wake. The priests and elders begged him to let go. The stench was rising, the body decaying. But how does a king bury half of his own soul? When he finally relented, the city wept. Women tore their garments. Warriors lowered their heads. Even the winds seemed to mourn. Enkidu was lowered into the earth, and with him descended the age of Gilgamesh, the invincible. From that moment, Gilgamesh changed. He no longer feared monsters. He feared mortality. He no longer sought glory. He sought escape. He no longer looked at his kingdom with pride. He saw shadows of death on every wall. And so, driven by a terror more ancient than any myth, he abandoned Uruk. He left behind his throne, his duties, and the rituals that tied him to Inanna's lineage. He wandered into the wilderness wearing skins, unrecognizable to his former subjects. The king who had once walked among priests and nobles now walked among scorpions and desert winds. He sought Utnapishtim, the one mortal granted immortality after surviving the great flood. He sought the secret the gods had denied to all humankind. He sought to tear from the universe the one answer he feared most. Must even kings die? Must even heroes fade? Must even sons of goddesses return to dust? His journey would take him past mountains guarded by beings with the bodies of men and the faces of scorpions, through tunnels of absolute darkness, where time itself seemed to stop, across oceans rowed by ferrymen older than kingdoms, and into the presence of the only mortal who ever escaped the grip of death. But the truth he found was not the truth he sought. Gilgamesh learned that immortality was not a secret hidden in the depths of the earth. It was a gift granted only once, under cosmic circumstances no king could repeat. And so he returned to Uruk shattered, wiser, and endlessly human. The hero who had slain monsters now built walls, tended cities, and recorded his story on clay tablets so future generations would remember him, not as a god, not as an immortal, but as a man who sought meaning in a world ruled by gods. And in the shadow of Inanna, the goddess who had offered him everything, Gilgamesh discovered what no divine union could give him: the courage to be mortal. Long before empires rose and fell, before scribes etched stories into clay, and before Gilgamesh ever walked the walls of Uruk, there stood a sanctuary that shaped the fate of an entire civilization. It was called Inanna, the House of Heaven. It was not merely a temple. It was the beating heart of Sumer, the axis mundi, where the mortal world touched the divine. And its ruler was not a king, nor a priest, nor any earthly authority. Its ruler was Inanna, the queen of heaven, the untamed goddess whose power radiated through stone, ritual, and economy. To the people of Uruk, Inanna was more than sacred ground. It was a gateway, a place where divine presence condensed into earthly form. Within its colossal walls, incense curled like living spirits, offerings steamed in bronze bowls, and priests chanted hymns in Sumerian, the world's oldest written language. The air itself seemed to hum with cosmic energy, as if the goddess's heartbeat echoed faintly through the corridors. But Inanna's power was not spiritual alone. This was the first great economic engine in human history. The temple controlled land, vast fields of barley, orchards of date palms, herds of sheep and cattle. It employed farmers, shepherds, millers, brewers, scribes, administrators, and artisans. Hundreds of workers depended on the temple not just for wages, but for food, shelter, and protection. Grain flowed into its storehouses like rivers of gold. Oil vats glistened in lamplight. Textiles woven by temple workers were traded across the Fertile Crescent. Caravans left its gates carrying goods stamped with the symbol of the eight-pointed star, Inanna's seal. This was no simple place of worship. It was a city within a city, a state within a state. Inanna did not rule through thunder or lightning. She ruled through infrastructure, through ritual, through the order of daily offerings and the flow of economy. Every loaf of bread, every cup of beer, every bolt of fabric produced by temple hands reinforced her presence in people's lives. To feed the temple was to feed the goddess. To enrich the temple was to maintain civilization itself. But who tended this divine machine? The priesthood of Inanna was unlike any other in the ancient world. At its pinnacle stood the high priestess, often a woman of royal blood. She was not merely a religious leader, she was Inanna's earthly embodiment. During the sacred marriage ritual, she became the goddess herself, consecrated in oils, dressed in shimmering garments, and adorned in lapis lazuli jewelry meant to mimic the stars. Her voice carried authority equal to kings. Her words could legitimize a ruler or unseat him. Below her was a labyrinth of specialized clergy. There were musicians who played harps designed for ritual frequencies. There were brewers whose barley beer was reserved solely for offerings. There were scribes trained to copy hymns written centuries before their birth. And then there were the gala priests, figures of fluid identity who sang laments in the feminine register, bridging the space between male and female, a reflection of Inanna herself, the goddess who transcended boundaries. Gender in her temple was not a fixed trait. It was a spectrum, a divine flow. The goddess who shifted between war and love, life and death, order and chaos, made space for priests whose identities mirrored her complexity. The gala served as guardians of lamentation songs, especially during the ritual's morning dumuzi, Inanna's slain lover. Their voices carried grief across the city like storm winds, and the people believed those laments held real power, that sorrow itself could coax the god of fertility back from the land of the dead. Every season, the temple echoed with these rituals. Mourning in summer, renewal in spring, ecstatic celebration at the new year. During the Akitu festival, Inanna transformed into a theater where cosmic cycles were reenacted. The king entered as a mortal and emerged as the chosen partner of Inanna. Through this union, fertility was guaranteed, crops were blessed, and the stability of the kingdom renewed for another year. These rituals were not symbolic, they were operational. To the Sumerians, ritual was technology. Just as irrigation ditches fed crops, ceremonies fed the cosmos. If the goddess was displeased, famine followed. If rituals faltered, floods or droughts were sure to come. The temple was the safeguard against cosmic disorder, a system of offerings, chants, dances, and sacrifices meant to keep the universe balanced. And yet, for all its splendor, Inanna was a place built of human hands. Its walls crumbled with age. Its beams sagged with time. Floods washed through its courtyards. Empires fought over its lands. But the temple always rose again, rebuilt, reimagined, renewed. For more than 3 millennia, kings poured resources into its restoration, believing that their power, their cities, and their lives depended upon the Queen of Heaven's favor. To walk through Inanna today, in ruins under the desert sun, is to see only fragments, walls worn to dust, foundations carved by time. But if one stands still long enough, the wind seems to whisper echoes of its ancient glory. The footsteps of priestesses, the cadence of hymns, the crackle of sacrificial fires, and the eternal hum of a goddess whose presence shaped the rise of civilization itself. Inanna was not a myth confined to clay tablets. She was infrastructure. She was policy. She was the invisible architecture of society. And the temple of Inanna, her throne, was the axis around which the world of Sumer revolved. If Inanna was the heart of Sumer, then its priestesses were its pulse, the living vessels through which the will of Inanna flowed into the world. They were not ornamental figures, nor passive caretakers of ritual. They were political forces, diplomats, poets, economists, astrologers, mediators, and sometimes even power brokers who held influence equal to, and often greater than, kings. In a civilization built on hierarchy and strict social order, the priestesses of Inanna Inanna existed outside the ordinary structure. They answered not to kings, nor to councils, nor to the elders of the city. They answered only to the goddess, and through them the goddess answered to no one. These women were known as Entu, high priestesses chosen from royal bloodlines and trained from childhood to embody the goddess. To be selected was both an honor and an exile. Once consecrated, an Entu left behind the world of family, marriage, and children. She belonged solely to Inanna. She became the goddess's voice, her ritual partner in the sacred marriage, and the guardian of the economic and spiritual functioning of Inanna. The most famous of these priestesses was Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, history's first named author. Her hymns to Inanna are not simply poems. They are political manifestos wrapped in devotion. In her writings, she recorded how rivals tried to depose her, how she was exiled from the temple, and how she called upon Inanna to restore her to power. And the goddess answered. Enheduanna returned to her post, her enemies scattered, her authority renewed. This was not mere literature. It was a testament to the real, tangible influence that a high priestess wielded, and she was not alone. Every major city had priestesses dedicated to Inanna, each presiding over temples that were not just spiritual centers but economic dynamos. They managed storehouses, oversaw trade routes, organized labor forces, and supervised scribes who recorded grain yields, livestock distributions, and textile production. A priestess of Inanna could decide who was fed and who was not, who worked and who waited, who prospered and who faded into obscurity. Inanna's cult created a class of women who operated with extraordinary autonomy. They were educated in reading and writing, skills rare even among men. They learned celestial observation, divination, medicinal herbs, ritual choreography, and diplomacy. They presided over disputes, performed marriages, interpreted omens, and conducted funerary rites. And in moments of crisis, the city looked to them for guidance. But their world was far from tranquil. The priestesses of Inanna walked a path lined with danger. Their power made them targets. Rival factions within the city sought to manipulate them. Kings attempted to bend their authority, and the goddess they served, fierce, unpredictable, unbound, demanded absolute loyalty. To fail Inanna was to invite catastrophe. Texts describe priestesses who were struck with sudden illness, madness, or misfortune after neglecting a ritual or acting against the temple's interests. Whether these stories reflect divine wrath or political maneuvering, the effect was the same. Inanna's priesthood commanded fear as much as reverence. Yet for all their power, these women lived inside an institution defined as much by restriction as freedom. They were bound to celibacy or sacred sexuality, depending on their rank. They were forbidden from owning property independently. They lived under the constant scrutiny of temple officials and the expectations of the goddess herself. Still within these constraints, they carved out spaces of extraordinary influence, and nowhere was this more visible than in the sacred marriage, the ritual union between the king and the goddess, enacted through the high priestess. This ceremony was more than a symbolic blessing. It was a contract between heaven and earth. The king entered the marriage chamber as a mortal. He emerged as the chosen consort of Inanna. His legitimacy, his right to rule, his claim over armies and fields and citizens depended on the priestess who embodied the goddess. Without her acceptance, his authority faltered. Without the ritual, the kingdom risked drought, famine, or divine abandonment. Thus, a single priestess could elevate a king or doom him. The political weight of this moment cannot be overstated. Many kings performed lavish gifts and grandiose acts to gain the favor of the priestess. Others feared her influence so deeply that they sought to replace or control her. Yet throughout 3 millennia, the priestesses of Inanna continued to act as intermediaries between ruler and divine power, shaping the destiny of cities and the fates of nations. Their presence radiated authority in every corner of the temple. They led processions through streets lined with citizens carrying incense and flowers. They stood at the head of choirs singing ancient hymns. They presided over offerings, reading omens in the flicker of oil lamps or the pattern of smoke rising from sacrificial fires. But perhaps the most profound aspect of their influence was their ability to preserve knowledge. The priestesses of Inanna maintained archives that recorded not just administrative documents, but hymns, myths, astronomical observations, and ritual instructions. Through their effort, Inanna's stories survived the collapse of kingdoms, the burning of cities, and the shifting tides of empire. They were living libraries, guardians of memory in a world where literacy was a rare and precious art. When we read the myths of the goddess today, when we uncover tablets bearing her hymns and her rituals, we are reading the legacy of these priestesses. Their hands shaped the clay. Their voices preserved the tradition. Their devotion carried the goddess through the storms of history. Inanna's priestesses were not simply servants of a deity. They were architects of civilization. They were the keepers of continuity. They were the bridges between the mortal and the divine. And their influence, subtle, profound, and far-reaching, changed the trajectory of ancient history in ways we are only now beginning to understand. Across the vast plains of Sumer, where the horizon shimmered like molten gold and the wind carried the scent of barley and river mud, the most important night of the year approached like a heartbeat echoing through the city walls. Every household knew it. Every farmer, every merchant, every soldier, every priestess felt the weight of it in their bones. The sacred marriage, the union between the king and the goddess, was coming. And nothing in Mesopotamia carried more power, more risk, or more cosmic meaning than this single ritual. To the Sumerians, this was not theater. It was not symbolism. It was the hinge on which the entire world turned. For the goddess Inanna, fertility was not an abstract blessing. It was life itself. It was the floodwaters that nourished the fields, the cattle that calved in the spring, the orchards heavy with fruit, the grain stored in clay jars through the long, scorching summers. It was the order that kept chaos away. The sacred marriage ensured these blessings, or withdrew them. And so, as the New Year festival approached, Uruk transformed. Torches were lit along the processional roads. Drums echoed through the streets like a living pulse. Women wove garlands of reeds and flowers. Priests purified their bodies with scented oils. And inside Inanna, the house of heaven, the high priestess prepared herself for the most dangerous role any mortal woman could embody. She would become Inanna for one night. The king, too, underwent purification rituals. His body was washed with river water at dawn. He was clothed in linen and gold, his crown polished until it caught the morning light like fire. But for all his adornment, he approached the goddess as a supplicant. For on this night, he was not yet a king. He had no authority, no divine mandate. He was simply a man, and the goddess would decide whether he was worthy of ruling her people. In the bustling courtyard of the temple, musicians tuned their lyres while singers rehearsed ancient hymns, verses older than cities, older than kings. These hymns described the union of Inanna and Dumuzi, the shepherd god whose passion and eventual death mirrored the cycles of nature. And as the performers practiced, the atmosphere thickened with anticipation. The ceremony had the gravity of a coronation and the intimacy of a love story whispered in darkness. Yet beneath the devotion, a current of fear flowed quietly. For if the ritual failed, if the king faltered, if the omens were unfavorable, if the priestess sensed impurity, famine could follow, drought, disease, social collapse. The sacred marriage was not merely a blessing, it was a responsibility that carried the weight of survival. As twilight descended, the king began his procession through the city. Citizens lined the streets, holding lamps that flickered like a river of stars guiding him toward the temple. Children were lifted onto shoulders to witness the moment. Old women whispered prayers. Farmers bowed their heads. Everyone understood that the king's performance tonight would shape their fortunes in the year to come. When the king arrived at the temple gates, the high priestess appeared. Adorned in lapis lazuli, gold, and white linen, she radiated the presence of the goddess. Her hair shimmered with oils scented with cedar and myrrh. Her gaze was calm, commanding, as if she were looking through him rather than at him. In that moment, she was no longer a woman. She was Inanna. The king offered gifts, baskets of dates, bowls of honey, vessels of beer brewed with aromatic herbs. He recited hymns promising loyalty, prosperity, and devotion. Each word was measured, rehearsed across weeks of preparation. Any misstep could be interpreted as a bad omen. Then the priestess responded, speaking in the voice of the goddess, a voice documented in tablets as ancient poetry, overflowing with sensuality and power. These hymns did not shy away from desire. They embraced it, celebrated it as the engine of creation. To the Sumerians, sexuality was not sinful. It was sacred. It was the language through which divine life entered the world. And so, with the city holding its breath, the king and priestess entered the marriage chamber, a room draped in linens and strewn with grasses meant to symbolize the fields of spring. Candles flickered along the walls, casting shadows that danced like spirits bearing witness. Outside, the crowd sang hymns that blended ecstasy with reverence. What happened inside the chamber has been debated by scholars for decades. Some interpret the ritual as symbolic, a dramatized union rather than a literal one. Others argue, based on temple architecture, administrative records, and hymns, that the union was physical, a consummation meant to embody the merging of divine and mortal realms. But regardless of its exact nature, one truth remains. The ritual held cosmic significance. When the king emerged, he did so transformed. No longer a mere man, he carried the mantle of Inanna's chosen. His right to rule had been affirmed not by lineage nor by conquest, but by the goddess herself. The crowd erupted in celebration. Drums boomed, dancers twirled, and singers lifted their voices in triumph. In the days that followed, the entire city celebrated. Feasts lasted until sunrise. Offerings were made, omens were read, and everywhere people felt renewed, as though the world had been rewound, set into motion once more. Yet beneath the joy, the ritual carried a darker thread. For the king, embodying Dumuzi meant accepting not only Inanna's blessing, but also Dumuzi's fate, death, descent, and sacrifice. This connection haunted Sumerian kings. To be chosen by the goddess was both a privilege and a terrifying destiny. The sacred marriage bestowed legitimacy, but it also bound the king to the cycles of death and rebirth, harvest and decay, abundance and loss. Inanna's love was powerful, but her lovers did not escape unscathed. The sacred marriage was the heart of Mesopotamian kingship. It was the ritual that stitched heaven to earth. It was the moment when a mortal dared to touch eternity. And as we turn to the next chapter of this journey, we will see how this same ritual, so full of beauty, fear, power, and consequence, became the fault line upon which entire civilizations rose and fell. When the torches of the sacred marriage finally dimmed and the hymns faded into the thick Mesopotamian night, the city of Uruk returned to its rhythms. But for the newly sanctified king, nothing returned to normal. He now carried the invisible weight of a cosmic pact, one that bound him not only to the land and its people, but to Inanna herself, a goddess whose passion could nurture a kingdom or destroy it without hesitation. To be chosen by her was to stand at the center of creation. It was also to stand on the edge of a blade. In the quiet mornings after the festival, while the temple courtyards were still perfumed with incense and the last offerings cooled on their altars, the king confronted the truth that all Sumerian rulers understood yet rarely admitted aloud. Divine favor was not a gift. It was a contract written in fire. If he governed wisely, crops would flourish, herds would multiply, and the rivers would fill with life. But if he faltered, through negligence, injustice, or impurity, the goddess could withdraw her blessing, plunging the entire region into famine, drought, or political chaos. No king dared ignore this possibility. Inanna was not a passive deity. She did not sit quietly in temples waiting for offerings. She intervened. She chose. She punished. She elevated. She destroyed. Her myths made this clear, and her priests never allowed rulers to forget it. Kingship in Sumer was not a secular institution draped in divine symbolism. It was a theological reality. The king stood as Dumuzi reborn each year, carrying the dual burden of abundance and death. His authority was inseparable from his vulnerability. The same ritual that crowned him also reminded him that he could be replaced by another mortal or by the will of the gods themselves. Political rivals understood this power dynamic all too well. When a king struggled, when the harvest failed or military campaigns faltered, whispers circulated through city streets, temple halls, and palace courts. The goddess is displeased. The king has lost her favor. And when enough people believed it, instability followed. A rival could present himself as the new chosen one. A priestess could question the legitimacy of the marriage ritual. A general could leave the king's side, claiming the goddess had turned her face elsewhere. Divine legitimacy was powerful, but fragile. It could elevate a shepherd to rule over city-states. It could also erase a dynasty in a single season. Even the king's personal life became entangled with divine expectation. His behavior, his justice, his restraint, his generosity, his purity, all were judged not only by the people, but by the temple. Priests interpreted omens. Priestesses traced patterns in the smoke of incense. Astronomers charted the movements of Venus, Inanna's celestial form, seeking warnings or approval in her shimmering path across the sky. If Venus rose bright and steady, the king could breathe easier. If it dimmed or behaved unexpectedly, fear spread quickly. The king's body itself became a symbol. If he grew weak, the land grew weak. If he suffered an illness, it meant the goddess was displeased. Kings prayed relentlessly, purified themselves constantly, and submitted to rituals meant to preserve the balance between heaven and earth. To rule in Sumer was not merely to govern, it was to embody cosmology. Every breath he took carried the weight of the sacred, and always the shadow of Dumuzi lingered. Because the king was the goddess's consort in ritual, he inherited the mythic fate of her eternal lover. Dumuzi's story was a cycle of passion, betrayal, death, and resurrection. The rhythm of nature itself. Fields flourished only to wither. Rivers swelled only to recede. Love blossomed only to mourn. And the king lived inside this cycle. Some scholars believe that early kings may have even feared literal sacrifice, though direct evidence is scarce. Yet fear alone shaped behavior. The king knew that to embody Dumuzi was to embody mortality. To be exalted was also to be endangered. Within this fragile balance, the king's court became a battleground of loyalties, ambitions, and interpretations of divine will. Advisors offered counsel wrapped in flattery, yet each carried personal motives. Generals pushed for campaigns that would expand the kingdom and their own prestige. Priests defended the temple's interests, sometimes positioning themselves as intermediaries between king and goddess. High priestesses navigated a delicate path, representing Inanna in ritual while maintaining influence over royal decisions. And common citizens watched from the margins, hoping that prosperity would triumph over chaos. For the king, every decision was amplified by divine consequence. A failed harvest could be blamed on improper offerings. A military defeat could be interpreted as divine anger. Even interpersonal disputes within the palace could take on cosmic implications. In this world, religion was not separate from politics. It was the foundation upon which political reality stood. When the goddess favored a king, no rival could oppose him. When she withdrew her favor, no army could save him. Across the centuries, Sumerian rulers crafted inscriptions proclaiming their devotion to Inanna. Some described themselves as her beloved. Others claimed she held their hand during battles. Many dedicated temples, offered lavish gifts, and wrote hymns celebrating her beauty, her strength, her wisdom, and her wrath. These inscriptions were not mere propaganda. They were expressions of existential necessity. The goddess's presence was felt in every aspect of governance. Without her, nothing could stand. And yet, the most profound aspect of divine kingship was not fear, it was possibility. Inanna's favor could transform a mere mortal into a figure woven into the fabric of the cosmos. Through her, kings became symbols of renewal, guardians of abundance, stewards of divine order. This transformation elevated the role of the king to something beyond human, a living link between the seen and unseen worlds. But such power could not exist without opposition. There were kings who abused their authority, provoking divine retribution. There were rulers who claimed the goddess's support without earning it. There were rival priests and priestesses who challenged the legitimacy of the throne, and there were entire cities that rose and fell depending on how well their kings upheld the sacred relationship. The story of Sumer is not simply the story of early civilization. It is the story of humans trying to live under the gaze of the divine, balancing duty and desire, fear and devotion, ambition and humility. And nowhere was this balance more tested than in the life of the king, the mortal who stood closest to the goddess and bore the greatest risk when her passions turned. As we move forward, we will see how this fragile connection between the mortal ruler and the Queen of Heaven shaped myths, wars, alliances, and the very rhythm of life in ancient Mesopotamia, and how the consequences of divine favor would one day lead to a confrontation unlike anything the ancient world had ever witnessed. Long before the fall of temples, and long before the last hymns drifted into silence, there was a moment in Sumerian memory when a mortal king made the unthinkable choice. He refused the Queen of Heaven. It is one of the boldest acts recorded in ancient literature, a decision so daring, so reckless, that its consequences rippled through centuries of myth-making. That king was Gilgamesh, ruler of Uruk, the city that belonged to Inanna herself. And the story of their confrontation reveals more about divine power, human autonomy, and cosmic consequence than any temple inscription or ritual hymn. The tale begins at the height of Gilgamesh's glory. Fresh from defeating Humbaba in the distant cedar forest, the king returned to Uruk adorned in robes, perfumed oils, and the triumphant aura of a hero who had challenged the boundaries of the world and survived. Citizens lined the streets to greet him. Priests burned incense in his honor. The river shimmered like polished bronze as he walked through the gates of the city he ruled with unmatched confidence. And it was in this moment, radiant, victorious, undeniably mortal, that Inanna's gaze fell upon him. Inanna, whose desires shaped destinies, saw in Gilgamesh a worthy consort. She approached him not with subtlety, but with the full, overwhelming force of her divine presence. She offered him gifts beyond imagination, chariots forged of lapis lazuli and gold, kings bowing before him, fields overflowing with grain, and a throne elevated above all others. To be her lover meant eternal prestige, cosmic legitimacy, and the favor of the most unpredictable goddess in the pantheon. But Gilgamesh did the unthinkable. He said no. His refusal was not gentle. It was not diplomatic. It was devastatingly direct. Gilgamesh listed one by one the fates of Inanna's previous lovers. He spoke of Dumuzi, condemned to mournful lamentation year after year. He recalled the lion hunted into traps, the horse driven to exhaustion, the shepherd transformed into a wolf, the gardener turned into a frog. With each name, he carved deeper into the wound. The goddess who bestowed blessing also destroyed. The queen who lifted kings also cursed them. Gilgamesh wanted no part in this fate. His autonomy mattered more than divine privilege. And with the arrogance of a hero at the peak of his life, he cast aside the most powerful force in Mesopotamian religion. Inanna's fury was immediate and overwhelming. She ascended to the heavens, trembling with indignation, and stood before her father Anu. There, in the celestial court, She demanded a weapon of cosmic proportions, the Bull of Heaven, a creature whose descent would signal catastrophe. Anu hesitated. He knew that releasing the bull meant famine, death, and chaos. Yet Inanna's rage could not be contained. She threatened to tear open the gates of the underworld, unleashing the dead upon the living until the world drowned in terror. Faced with such devastation, Anu yielded. The bull descended. Its hooves cracked the earth. Each snort opened chasms that swallowed men by the hundreds. The city of Uruk trembled beneath its weight, and the sky darkened with dust. But Gilgamesh and Enkidu stood firm. Together they fought the divine beast. Enkidu grasped its tail, anchoring the creature long enough for Gilgamesh to strike the fatal blow. With the bull dead, the heroes celebrated, but their triumph carried a price. When Enkidu hurled the thigh of the bull at Inanna, a terrible silence fell across the heavens. It was not simply an insult, it was sacrilege, and it sealed their fate. The gods convened. The council decided that one of the heroes must die to restore cosmic balance. Gilgamesh lived because he was king, but Enkidu, the wild man crafted by the gods themselves, was condemned. His withering illness and slow descent into death became the turning point of the epic, forcing Gilgamesh into the long, mournful search for immortality. But beneath the surface of myth lies a deeper question. Why did the people of Uruk preserve this story? Why did they choose to remember a moment when their own king insulted their own goddess? Perhaps because it reflected a truth they recognized, that devotion does not erase conflict, that love does not erase danger, and that even the mightiest gods could be challenged by the mortal desire for selfhood. Gilgamesh's defiance symbolized the yearning of humanity to break free from divine expectations, to carve out a destiny shaped not by cosmic whims, but by personal choice. And Inanna's response reflected the reality that no one, not even a king, could reject the divine without consequence. Ancient audiences understood something modern readers often miss. This was not a story of good versus evil. It was a story of imbalance versus consequence. Inanna was not simply vengeful. She was the embodiment of passion, authority, and the unpredictable nature of life itself. Gilgamesh was not simply arrogant. He was the embodiment of the mortal striving for identity, meaning, and autonomy. Their conflict reflected the eternal tension between cosmic order and human ambition, a tension that shaped the mythic landscape of Mesopotamia for millennia. As we move forward, the line between myth and reality will blur even more, because the stories of the gods were not just stories. They were reflections of the political, emotional, and spiritual systems that governed ancient life. And nowhere is that clearer than in the next chapter, where temples, rituals, and worship reveal the living legacy of the Queen of Heaven. To understand why the myths of Inanna endured, why her fury terrified kings and her blessings shaped empires, we must leave the swirling world of legend and step into the physical stone and clay reality of her presence. Because Inanna was not merely a character in a story, she was a force woven into the architecture of early civilization. Her power lived not only in hymns or epics, but in colossal temples that dominated entire skylines, in economic systems that shaped cities, and in rituals performed daily by priests, priestesses, and ordinary citizens who believed their survival depended on her favor. And nowhere was her presence more overwhelming than in Uruk, the city she claimed as her own. Standing before the ruins of Inanna, the House of Heaven, one can still feel the echoes of a world where humans built monuments not merely to worship, but to connect with the divine realm. The temple complex was not a single building, but a sprawling sacred district, layered across more than 3,000 years of continuous construction. Walls rose and fell. Shrines were rebuilt, expanded, redesigned. Courtyards shifted. Platforms were raised. And with each reconstruction, the temple grew more monumental, more intricate, more capable of projecting the authority of the goddess who ruled over it. The earliest phases of Inanna, dating as far back as 3500 BCE, reveal architecture so advanced it challenges modern assumptions about early urban life. Vast platforms built of mud brick were faced with mosaics made from thousands of colored stone cones pressed into wet plaster, forming geometric patterns that shimmered under the desert sun. When ancient worshippers approached the temple, they would have seen walls glowing with color, green, white, black, arranged in patterns that invoked cosmic order. These were not simply decorations, they were offerings, labor-intensive acts of devotion designed to transform a building into a portal between earth and heaven. And at the heart of this ancient complex stood one of the most iconic artifacts of early Sumer, the Uruk vase. Carved from alabaster nearly 3 feet tall, the vase depicts in exquisite detail the ritual life surrounding Inanna. At its base, waves symbolizing abundance flow into images of plants and animals. Above them, rows of naked men carry offerings, baskets of fruit, jars of wine, bundles of grain, approaching the goddess or her priestess, standing at the doorway of the temple, flanked by her sacred reed bundle standards. This single object captures an entire worldview, the land's prosperity rising upward like a procession, all leading to Inanna, the giver and receiver of life. But temples in ancient Mesopotamia were far more than spiritual centers. They were economic engines, the beating heart of the city's wealth. Inanna managed vast farmlands, herds, storehouses, breweries, and textile workshops. Clay tablets from the temple archives describe transactions, wages, offerings, and inventories with meticulous precision. Written in early cuneiform, these tablets show that the temple employed administrators, scribes, farmers, cooks, brewers, weavers, priests, singers, guards, and laborers. It was not just a place of worship, it was an entire ecosystem. The Sumerians did not separate the sacred from the practical. Feeding the goddess meant feeding the city. Prosperity in the fields meant prosperity in the temple. And the temple's abundance was a sign that Inanna's favor flowed through every corner of urban life. This intertwined system of religion and economics shaped the social hierarchy as well. At the top stood the high priestess, a position of immense influence. Often drawn from elite families or even royal bloodlines, the high priestess embodied Inanna during rituals, most dramatically during the sacred marriage. She was not a symbolic figure. She wielded political and spiritual authority, often equal to or greater than that of the king. Her hymns, like those of Enheduanna, shaped theology, legitimized rulers, and defined the goddess's character across centuries. Below the high priestesses were other priestesses dedicated to various rituals, some associated with sexuality, others with lamentation, others with purification. Their roles were not marginal or stigmatized. They were honored as vital conduits between the mortal and divine realms. In a society where the gods shaped every element of existence, to serve the goddess directly was among the highest honors imaginable. But Inanna's cult also included male priests, most famously the Gala, individuals who occupied unique gender roles within temple service. The Gala sang in the dialect associated with women and performed lamentations for Dumuzi during the rituals of midsummer. Ancient texts suggest that their gender expression blurred traditional boundaries, reflecting Inanna's own fluidity and her power to transform. Their presence shows a society where spiritual function, not binary identity, determined one's sacred role. Each day in Inanna followed a precise rhythm. At dawn, priests performed the awakening of the goddess, presenting food, beer, and incense before her statue. Midday offerings followed, then evening rites, each reinforcing the connection between deity and worshipper. These offerings were real: bread baked in temple kitchens, beer brewed from temple grain, meat from temple herds. After being ritually presented, they were redistributed to the temple staff and the wider community. Nothing was wasted. Everything served a purpose. Festivals punctuated the year, marking moments when the boundary between human and divine grew thin. The New Year festival brought the sacred marriage. Midsummer brought the laments for Dumuzi. Other celebrations honored Inanna as warrior, protector, lover, or judge. During these events, the temple came alive with processions, music, dance, and theatrical reenactments of mythic events. Citizens participated not as observers, but as co-creators of sacred time. And Inanna's worship extended far beyond Uruk. Temples in Zabalam, Nippur, Lagash, Kish, Adab, and dozens of other cities carried her symbols: the eight-pointed star, the lion, the reeds tied in bundles. Each community shaped her rituals slightly differently, reflecting local customs and political needs. But everywhere she remained the same essential deity, unpredictable, powerful, intimate, and awe-inspiring. As centuries passed and empires rose and fell, Inanna's cult transformed. Under the Akkadians, she merged with Ishtar. Under the Babylonians, she became an astral goddess linked to Venus. Under the Assyrians, she ascended to heights unparalleled by any other deity, sometimes overshadowing even the national god Ashur. Yet the core of her worship endured: devotion, vulnerability, passion, and fear. To stand in her temple was to stand at the edge of the divine world. It was here that kings were crowned, here that priestesses gained authority, here that the rhythms of nature were synchronized with human life, here that the Queen of Heaven touched the earth. And in the next chapter of her story, that touch would extend beyond Sumer and Akkad, shaping cultures across the Near East, rewriting myths, and echoing through civilizations that had never even heard her name. As the centuries unfolded and city-states rose like waves cresting along the Fertile Crescent, Inanna's influence did not fade. It expanded, adapted, and transformed with uncanny resilience. Few deities in human history traveled as far, survived as much, or reshaped themselves so completely while remaining unmistakably the same. To trace the goddess from the mud-brick temples of early Sumer to the towering palaces of the Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian empires is to witness the evolution of belief at a civilizational scale. What began as the devotion of a single city would become a force shaping the spiritual architecture of the ancient Near East for more than 3,000 years. The key turning point came with Sargon of Akkad, the founder of the world's first empire. When he unified Sumerian city-states with the northern Akkadian territories, he did not simply conquer their lands. He merged their pantheons. To bind his empire spiritually, he elevated a single goddess above all others, Inanna, known in Akkadian as Ishtar. Whether Ishtar had once been a separate deity or was simply the Akkadian interpretation of the Sumerian goddess remains debated by scholars, but what matters is how profoundly Sargon embraced her. He claimed that she granted him victory in battle, that she guided his conquests, that she walked beside him as he forged a new political order. And to solidify that bond, he appointed his daughter, Enheduanna, as high priestess of History remembers her not only as a religious leader, but as the world's earliest named author. Through her hymns, she shaped how generations would understand the goddess. In her words, Inanna was not merely powerful. She was overwhelming, transcendent, terrifying, radiant. And Enheduanna described her as the storm that lights the sky, the goddess whose victories echoed across the land like thunder rolling over mountains. Her compositions fused Sumerian theology with Akkadian political ideology, forming a unified vision of divine authority that stretched across languages, cultures, and cities. Under Akkadian rule, Inanna Ishtar took on a more militaristic persona. She became not only the goddess of love and fertility, but the goddess of battle. She was invoked before campaigns. She was thanked after victories. She was feared by enemies. Kings across the empire styled themselves as her chosen warriors, and priests interpreted battlefield outcomes as reflections of her favor or displeasure. The duality at the heart of her character, passion and aggression, desire and destruction became even more pronounced. But the Akkadian Empire eventually fell, and with its collapse came a resurgence of Sumerian traditions. During the third dynasty of the old rituals of Inanna returned with renewed vigor. Temples were rebuilt, hymns were restored, festivals regained their ancient rhythm. Yet even during this revival, her identity had already been irrevocably reshaped by centuries of syncretism. She was no longer solely the vibrant goddess of Uruk. She had become a deity whose influence stretched across the entire region. And then came Babylon. As Babylon rose to power, its religious system evolved into a new structure. The male deity Marduk ascended as the city's supreme god, yet Ishtar held a prominent position. She became the astral manifestation of Venus, the brilliant morning and evening star, whose celestial movements were tracked by Babylonian astronomers with unprecedented detail. These scholars understood Venus's cycles with extraordinary precision, charting its disappearances and reappearances, its shifting brightness, and its uncanny predictability. The goddess's link to Venus only deepened her complexity. To the Babylonians, her celestial path reflected her divine nature, vanishing into the underworld only to rise again in radiant splendor. Her cosmic behavior echoed her myths. Her descent and return were written across the heavens themselves. But if Babylon preserved her astral majesty, the Assyrians amplified her power. Under the Neo-Assyrian Empire, Ishtar reached her most formidable form. She became the empire's true protector, its divine patroness, its embodiment of military might. Her temples in Nineveh and Arbela were centers of prophecy and royal consultation. Kings visited these temples before campaigns. Priestesses delivered oracles in her name. Royal inscriptions describe scenes where the goddess appears in visions, urging kings into battle or promising victory with the force of a roaring storm. In Assyrian art, she stands on the backs of lions, radiating light, bow drawn, arrows poised to strike. Her star, the eight-pointed symbol that identified her across centuries, adorned gates, weapons, amulets, and palace walls. She was the divine engine behind imperial expansion, the spiritual force that justified conquest. Through her, the Assyrian kings claimed a mandate stronger than lineage. They were chosen by the Queen of Heaven to rule the world. Yet even in this martial form, the goddess of love never vanished. The Assyrians maintained her festivals, rituals, and sexuality-linked priesthoods. They simply placed greater emphasis on her warlike nature, reflecting the needs of a society built on conquest. Outside Mesopotamia, her influence spread even farther. The Phoenician goddess Astarte, the Canaanite Ashtoreth, the Hittite Shaushka, all carried echoes of Inanna Ishtar. Myths were borrowed, adapted, and retold in new languages. Even the Greek goddess Aphrodite, though rooted in local traditions, bears unmistakable traces of Mesopotamian influence, particularly in her combination of beauty, desire, and destructive potential. Some scholars even see parallels between the stories of Ishtar and the mythic narratives that later shaped classical literature. By the first millennium BCE, the goddess had become something rare in the ancient world, a transcultural deity recognized in different forms across vast distances. Her symbols traveled along trade routes. Her stories crossed linguistic barriers. Her cults adapted to new political realities without losing the fierce independence that defined her from the start. But as powerful as she remained, change was coming. New religions were rising. Religions that had no room for a goddess of love and war, of desire and destruction. The world that once celebrated multiplicity and complexity would gradually shift toward new theological frameworks. Yet before that transformation reached its peak, Inanna Ishtar would leave one final indelible mark on the cultures that followed. For now, her story continues to grow, spreading outward like the light of a star that, even in disappearance, always returns. For more than 3,000 years, Inanna, Ishtar, reigned over one of the most sophisticated and influential religious systems the ancient world had ever known. Her temples shaped economies. Her myths shaped kingship. Her rituals shaped the lives of millions. Yet even the most powerful deities are bound to the tides of history. Every civilization faces its dusk, every belief system its twilight, and every god, no matter how radiant, eventually confronts silence. For Inanna, the long descent from heavenly queen to forgotten relic did not happen in a single moment. It unfolded across centuries, a slow erosion shaped by conquests, cultural shifts, and the emergence of new worldviews that left no space for a goddess of contradiction. The first tremors of decline came not from war or disaster, but from linguistic change. As Sumerian faded from everyday speech, and Akkadian rose in its place, the ancient hymns became harder to understand. Priests preserved them in formal training, but ordinary citizens no longer grasped the stories the way their ancestors had. An oral tradition, once shared openly, became an esoteric knowledge guarded by scribes. Even so, the temples continued their work. Clay tablets show offerings still being recorded, rituals still being performed, priestesses still receiving elaborate garments. But beneath the surface, something subtle was shifting. The goddess who once guided empires now depended increasingly on tradition rather than devotion. Her power remained immense, yet the emotional connection that bound people to her began to wane. The next turning point came with the rise of Babylon, whose theology centered on Marduk. Though Ishtar held a prominent place, she was no longer the unquestioned queen. She became one among many, revered but not supreme. The great creation myth, the Enuma Elish, placed Marduk at the center of cosmic order, subtly redefining the structure of divine hierarchy. And while Ishtar still commanded temples, priests, and festivals, the gravitational center of the pantheon had shifted. Yet it was not until the rise of the Persian Achaemenid Empire that the foundations of Mesopotamian religion truly began to crack. The Persians brought with them a radically different worldview, one shaped by Zoroastrian dualism, a stark cosmic battle between Ahura Mazda and the forces of darkness. In such a system, gods who embodied both creation and destruction, love and war, fertility and drought, no longer fit comfortably. Inanna's very nature, fluid, complex, morally ambiguous, clashed with a theology built on binaries. Still, the temples endured. Even the conquering kings of Persia respected the local gods, offering sacrifices in their names and maintaining their clergy. Yet the empire's spiritual atmosphere subtly eroded the framework that sustained Inanna's cult. The goddess remained honored, but the world was changing around her, slowly pushing her toward the margins. The seismic shift arrived with the expansion of Hellenistic culture after the campaigns of Alexander the Great. Greek philosophy, Greek gods, and Greek cosmology blended with Mesopotamian religion in complex ways. Ishtar became associated with Artemis, Aphrodite, and other Mediterranean figures. Some worshippers adopted hybrid practices, others clung to older rituals. But the cultural fusion diluted the distinct character of Inanna's ancient identity. She survived, but only through adaptation, never again as the unchallenged sovereign of heaven and earth. And then came the final transformation, the rise of monotheism. Judaism, already present for centuries, grew stronger under successive empires. Christianity spread rapidly across the Near East, carrying with it a worldview that rejected the entire foundation of polytheistic religion. The old gods were recast not as neutral figures of myth, but as dangerous idols, remnants of a past that, in the eyes of monotheistic leaders, needed to be purged. Temples were not only abandoned, but sometimes intentionally dismantled or repurposed. Sacred objects were destroyed. Rituals were outlawed. The priesthoods dissolved. And the goddess who had guided armies, blessed lovers, and shaped kingdoms found herself increasingly unwelcome in the spiritual landscape of the late ancient world. The last cuneiform tablets mentioning Ishtar date to the 1st or 2nd century CE. After that, her voice falls silent. By the 6th century, her temples had collapsed into ruins, buried under layers of sand and time. Vines climbed the remains of once mighty ziggurats. Herd animals grazed where priestesses once sang hymns. Wind drifted across courtyards where kings once presented offerings. The house of heaven, Inanna, no longer touched the sky. It lay quiet, broken, and forgotten by all but the earth that had once trembled when the goddess walked. Yet even in decline, her story lingered. Travelers passed by the ruins of Uruk and wrote of ancient wonders lost to time. Priests of new religions denounced practices centuries old, unaware of the depth and richness behind the rites they condemned. And beneath the dust, the clay tablets slept, thousands upon thousands of them, recording myths, rituals, prayers, offerings, and administrative accounts. They waited in silence until the 19th century, when modern archaeologists began to uncover them. Slowly, painstakingly, Inanna rose again, not as a living goddess, not as a force of worship, but as a voice preserved in clay. Scholars deciphered her hymns. Historians reconstructed her rituals. Artists rediscovered her myths, and modern readers, tracing her through translations and fragments, found themselves drawn to her complexity, her power, her refusal to be simplified. Inanna's fall was not a disappearance. It was a transformation from deity to memory, from queen to myth, from living presence to archaeological resurrection. And in many ways, this resurrection was necessary to understand her fully, for only after centuries of silence could modern minds appreciate the extraordinary span of her influence. Only after the fall of empires could the goddess's story be told without political motive. Only after her name faded from ritual could it rise again in scholarship, literature, and imagination. Yet the greatest transformation was still to come, a renaissance not of temples, but of ideas, because Inanna's legacy would echo into cultures far beyond Mesopotamia, reshaping goddesses from Canaan to Greece, from Anatolia to Rome. Her lineage, like a river branching through time, would feed mythologies that shaped the Western world. And to follow that lineage is to understand why the Queen of Heaven never truly vanished. When the old world began to fracture and the temples of Mesopotamia dimmed, Inanna did not vanish. She shifted, not as a fading silhouette, but as a force slipping through the cracks of history into new cultures, new languages, and new mythologies. Few deities have demonstrated such resilience, such fluidity, such capacity to transcend borders and survive the collapse of the civilizations that first worshipped them. Yet here, in the slow transformation that carried her from Sumer to the Mediterranean world, we see not decline, but metamorphosis. The Queen of Heaven shed one name after another, but her essence endured. The first great cultural bridge was Akkad, where the Sumerian Inanna fused with the Semitic Ishtar. This merging was not a mere theological adjustment. It was a shift in identity. Under Akkadian influence, the goddess absorbed an even broader range of powers: Stormbringer, Battle Lioness, Cosmic Judge, Protector of Kings. Her personality expanded, sharpened, and took on new political weight. Her celestial aspect as Venus grew more defined, her morning and evening phases interpreted as symbols of descent and return. From Akkad, she flowed into Babylon, where scribes reinterpreted her astral significance. The Babylonians were masters of celestial observation, charting Venus's movements with a precision unmatched for millennia. Through their sophisticated astronomy, they linked her behavior in the heavens to the fate of kingdoms. Each disappearance of Venus, each moment when the goddess slipped into the underworld of the night sky, became a cosmic omen. Each return was a resurrection. In this way, the myth of the descent of Inanna became encoded not only in story but in the very stars. But the most profound transformation came through cultural diffusion, the slow, quiet migration of beliefs through merchants, sailors, soldiers, treaties, and border settlements. As political boundaries shifted, myths drifted with them. Along the shores of the Levant, she became Astarte. Here, the goddess took on a new role as a patron of maritime trade, fertility, and war. The Phoenicians, masters of the sea, carried her across the Mediterranean. Her symbols, the star, the lion, the crescent, and the dove, appeared on votive offerings, temple inscriptions, and coastal sanctuaries. Astarte, like Inanna, embodied contradictions. She was both nurturing and predatory, sensual and deadly. In Ugarit, in Sidon, in Tyre, she flourished as a goddess whose blessing could bring flourishing ports and whose wrath could sink ships. The Hebrews knew her too. In the Hebrew Bible, she is called Ashtoreth, described with suspicion, even condemnation, not because she was obscure, but because she was powerful, a deity whose influence ran so deep that it posed a threat to emerging monotheistic frameworks. Prophets warned against her. Kings struggled to suppress her cult. Yet the fact that these texts mention her so fervently reveals her grip on the population. Even as Israelite identity took shape, the Queen of Heaven still whispered through the cultural winds. Farther north in the mountains of Anatolia, she became Shaushka among the Hittites. Here she danced across ritual tablets, performing healing rituals and martial blessings. The Hittites portrayed her as a shapeshifter who could appear male or female, echoing the gender fluidity long preserved in her Sumerian traditions. It was here that her androgynous nature reached new expression, the goddess who crossed boundaries becoming a deity who dissolved them entirely. And then, across the sea, her image entered the Greek world. This was not a simple adoption. Greek culture absorbed foreign ideas through layers of interpretation. The goddess they recognized was Aphrodite, who emerged with her own local traditions but carried unmistakable echoes of the Mesopotamian archetype. Her connection to love, beauty, sexuality, and the ocean mirrors Astarte. Her volatile passions, capable of causing war or reconciliation, mirror Ishtar. Even her mythic origins bear traces of older patterns, a goddess born from sea foam, radiant and dangerous, desired and feared. Later Greek poets, Homer among them, wrote scenes where Aphrodite fled the battlefield wounded, crying to Zeus for protection. This image parallels Inanna's wrath in the Epic of Gilgamesh, her fury when scorned, her capacity for destruction when denied. These similarities are not accidents. They are the fossilized footprints of a goddess migrating through cultural layers. Under Rome, Aphrodite transformed again into Venus, patroness of empire, ancestor of Julius Caesar through the mythical lineage of Aeneas. And with this link, the Queen of Heaven re-entered the political world, now reshaped to serve Roman expansion. Her astral identity as the planet Venus remained intact, her symbolism adapted to the needs of a vast and militarized civilization. The goddess had traveled far, farther than any other deity of the ancient Near East except perhaps the storm gods. But Inanna's metamorphosis was unique. She did not fade into a single successor. She scattered, reappeared, multiplied. In the Levant, she was Astarte. In Anatolia, Shaushka. In Greece, Aphrodite. In Rome, Venus. Across North Africa, Cyprus, Sicily, and Spain, she appeared under local names and local adaptations. Her story shows something profound. A truly powerful deity does not disappear. She adapts. She does not resist the erosion of time. She flows with it. She does not cling to a single identity. She expands into many. Yet even as she thrived elsewhere, the land that first worshipped her, Sumer and Akkad, had fallen silent. Her temples were ruins, her hymns forgotten, her priests gone. But her essence lived on in the mythologies of peoples who had never seen Uruk, never walked through Inanna, never read a single cuneiform tablet. Inanna had become a mythic ancestor to goddesses across continents, a foundational archetype so deeply rooted in human consciousness that she resurfaced wherever civilizations blossomed. But her journey was not finished, because in time, archaeologists would resurrect her from the dust, scholars would restore her voice, and a modern world hungry for lost wisdom would rediscover the Queen of Heaven in ways her ancient worshippers could never have imagined. By the time the modern world took shape, its empires forged from industry rather than myth, its laws written in ink rather than clay, the memory of Inanna had become a whisper. The once great cities of Mesopotamia lay buried under centuries of wind-blown sand, forgotten by the very cultures that now walked the earth above them. Uruk, the vibrant heart of her worship, had become a mound on the horizon. Nippur, the spiritual center of Sumer, collapsed into 6-meter layers of dust. The temples that once touched heaven now slept beneath the quiet weight of time. But history has a way of resurfacing when least expected. In the 19th century, as European explorers ventured into the Middle East in search of biblical confirmation, ancient wonders, and imperial prestige, they stumbled upon fragments of a civilization older than anything the West had imagined. What began as curiosity, amateur digs by diplomats, merchants, military officers, soon escalated into a global race to uncover the origins of human history. And somewhere beneath that frenzy, beneath the tents, the brushes, the shovels, and the journals, something else was stirring. The voice of the Queen of Heaven returning from the depths of the earth. The first clues were tablets, small, unassuming rectangles of clay impressed with wedge-shaped signs. At first, no one understood them. They were believed to be decorative, symbolic, or even magical. But as more tablets surfaced from sites like Nineveh, Babylon, and Uruk, scholars realized they were looking at something far more extraordinary. The earliest written language in human history, the cuneiform script, silent for millennia, waited patiently for its decipherment. Then came the breakthrough. In 1857, 4 scholars independently translated the same Akkadian inscription with nearly identical results. The world suddenly had a key to unlock thousands of buried texts. And when archaeologists began to organize these tablets, myths, hymns, administrative records, letters, rituals, one name emerged again and again, rising from the dust with unstoppable momentum: Inanna. Her stories had survived in shards, fragments, and broken lines, yet enough remained to illuminate her character with vivid clarity. Her descent into the underworld, her love for Dumuzi, her fury against Gilgamesh, her hymns written by Enheduanna, her roles as warrior, lover, stormbringer, and astral goddess. Myths that once echoed through temple courtyards suddenly came alive on the desks of scholars in London, Berlin, Paris, and Istanbul. The modern world found itself face to face with a deity more complex than any known from classical myth, a goddess who possessed the tenderness of Aphrodite and the ferocity of Athena, the sovereignty of Hera and the passion of Artemis, combined in a single breathtaking figure. She was both the morning star and the evening star, both the seducer and the destroyer, both the lover and the executioner. She embodied contradictions that modern categories struggled to contain. As excavations expanded in the 20th century, entire cities resurfaced. At Sir Charles Leonard Woolley uncovered the royal cemetery, filled with treasures that stunned the world: gold, lapis lazuli, silver, shell mosaics, revealing a level of sophistication and wealth that challenged all previous assumptions about ancient civilizations. At Nippur, archaeologists uncovered temple libraries filled with hymns and ritual texts. At Kish, Adab, Lagash, and other forgotten cities, statues, seals, and architectural remains painted a vivid picture of a culture deeply shaped by divine presence. And at Uruk, the epicenter of Inanna's worship, something even more monumental emerged: the Inanna precinct itself. Layer after layer revealed a city older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than nearly any monumental architecture known. The cone mosaic temple walls, the colossal platforms, the ceremonial courtyards, all of it testified to a goddess whose influence transcended not only politics, but imagination. As Inanna resurfaced, scholars began to debate her nature. Was she a fertility goddess, A war deity? A celestial being? Was she originally Sumerian? Or had her earliest roots come from even older cultures lost to time? Why did she wield such contradictory powers? Why did she inspire such devotion and such fear? Early interpretations struggled to fit her into neat categories inherited from classical studies, but Inanna refused simplification. She was too vast, too layered, too deeply woven into the fabric of early humanity. The archaeological rediscovery of her mythological corpus also illuminated something unexpected: the emotional depth of ancient Sumerian literature. Far from primitive or simplistic, the hymns to Inanna reveal a sophisticated understanding of power, vulnerability, desire, grief, transcendence, and cosmic law. Her descent to the underworld is not merely a myth, it is a psychological journey into despair and rebirth. Her relationship with Dumuzi is not simply romantic, it is an exploration of cycles, sacrifice, and the fragility of joy. Her conflict with Gilgamesh is not just divine anger, it is a confrontation between human autonomy and celestial authority. By the late 20th century, Inanna had become a subject of scholarly fascination and artistic revival. Feminist writers drew upon her as a symbol of empowerment. Historians recognized her as the earliest fully developed goddess in recorded history. Psychologists interpreted her descent as an archetype of transformation, and spiritual communities began to revisit her ancient hymns, seeking resonance in a deity who embodied both shadows and light. The modern rediscovery of Inanna did not bring back her temples, nor did it restore her priesthood, but it awakened something else, an awareness of the depth and complexity of early human spirituality, a recognition that the stories written in clay were not simple myths. They were reflections of the human condition, encoded in the earliest language, preserved through unimaginable spans of time. And as the dust was brushed from the tablets, and as the translations multiplied, the world realized something profound. The Queen of Heaven had never truly disappeared. She had merely waited for humanity to become capable of hearing her again. Yet there is still more to uncover, because the resurrection of her voice is only the beginning. In the next part of her story, we step beyond archaeology and into the realm of meaning, exploring why this ancient goddess still speaks so powerfully to a world far removed from ziggurats and clay tablets. When Inanna's stories resurfaced from the dust, when archaeologists pieced together the tablets, when scholars finally read the wedge-shaped signs, when her voice rose again after 3,000 silent years, something extraordinary happened. The modern world listened, and the question that began to echo across disciplines was simple, yet profound. Why does an ancient Sumerian goddess still resonate so deeply today? Why does she feel modern, even timeless? The answer lies not in nostalgia or exoticism, but in the astonishing complexity of her character. Complexity that mirrors the human psyche with uncanny precision. Inanna is not a goddess of one emotion, one domain, one archetype. She is not merely a mother goddess, a love deity, a destroyer, a celestial warrior, or a patron of kings. She is all of these at once. She is contradiction embodied, paradox personified. Her myths refuse simplicity because life itself refuses it. And in an age struggling to reconcile identity, emotion, power, and vulnerability, Inanna's ancient stories feel, unexpectedly, familiar. Her descent to the underworld speaks to anyone who has confronted emotional darkness, depression, trauma, or the shattering of identity. Her return speaks to transformation, rebirth, and self-reconstruction. Her love for Dumuzi reflects longing, attachment, loss, reconciliation, and the cyclical nature of human relationships. Her rage at Gilgamesh expresses the thorny intersection between desire, power, boundaries, and rejection. Her cosmic ambitions, stealing the Ami, seizing the foundations of civilization, echo the modern drive for autonomy, reinvention, and mastery of one's own destiny. This is why she feels contemporary, because Inanna is raw humanity carved into clay. As scholars translated her hymns, especially those written by Inanna, the world's first known author, another revelation emerged. The emotional interiority of ancient people was not primitive. It was rich, intimate, and profoundly reflective. Inanna wrote about despair, exile, longing, and divine ecstasy with a voice that could have come from a modern poet. When she called Inanna the light that returns after darkness, she was not just speaking of a goddess, she was speaking of the human need for resilience. Modern psychologists recognize this immediately. Jungian analysts saw Inanna as the archetypal journey into the unconscious, the descent, the shadow, the confrontation, the integration. Feminist scholars saw in her an unapologetically powerful feminine figure, one who wielded authority without subordination. Anthropologists saw the remnants of pre-patriarchal religious structures that once granted women greater ritual agency. And artists saw a muse. Her image, radiant, terrifying, sensual, crowned with horned headdresses or surrounded by lions, began to reappear in paintings, novels, poems, and even musical compositions. Many modern reinterpretations depict her as a force of cosmic equilibrium, balancing life and death, creation and destruction. Spiritual seekers rediscovered her hymns and found in them a language of ritual, empowerment, and transformation. In contemporary goddess-centered spirituality, Inanna represents liberation from restrictive roles, the embrace of full emotional truth, and the courage to descend into the underworld of the self, to emerge renewed. Yet her modern relevance is not limited to psychology, feminism, or spirituality. In an era obsessed with origins of writing, cities, civilization itself, Inanna stands at the crossroads of humanity's first great leap into urban life. The Me, the divine powers she seized, represent culture itself, kingship, craft, music, law, war, wisdom, seduction. Her myths encode the Sumerian understanding of what it means to build a society, to create order out of chaos. And so the rediscovery of Inanna becomes something larger than archaeology. It becomes a rediscovery of our own origins, our first stories, our first fears, our first dreams of divinity. The Queen of Heaven, once worshipped in temples taller than any building of her time, now finds a new temple in the modern imagination. She is no longer a deity of offerings and incense, of sacrifice and ritual lamentation. She is a mirror held up to the human experience. Her immortality did not survive through faith. It survived through meaning, through the resonance of her contradictions, through the emotional depth encoded in clay, through the endurance of stories that refused to die. And now, in the digital age, in an era of screens, satellites, and artificial intelligence, the goddess who once embodied Venus, the morning and evening star, appears more relevant than ever because she represents something timeless, the struggle to be whole in a world of fragmentation. The rediscovery of Inanna is the rediscovery of a part of ourselves, one that ancient people understood intimately, and that we are only now beginning to remember. Among all the myths carved into clay, perhaps none has captivated modern thinkers more than Inanna's descent, a journey that goes far beyond the religious beliefs of ancient Sumer. To psychologists, mythologists, scholars of religion, and countless readers, the descent is not merely a story, it is an archetype, a blueprint of human transformation. If the theft of the Me represents the expansion of consciousness, and if the sacred marriage reflects the union of opposites, then the descent is the most human of all Inanna's myths, because it is the myth of falling apart and becoming new. And it begins with a question that resonates across millennia. Why would a goddess of beauty, sexuality, love, war, fertility, and cosmic authority willingly walk into the land of the dead. The Sumerian tablets give several answers. Her sister Ereshkigal had lost her husband. Death demanded acknowledgement. Power demanded confrontation. The underworld demanded a visitor. But at a deeper symbolic level, modern interpreters have long argued that Inanna descended because she had to. Because no being, divine or mortal, can attain fullness without passing through darkness. Because transformation always demands the surrender of what came before. Her descent begins with preparation and intention. She sets her mind to the underworld, a phrase Sumerian scribes often used to indicate an irreversible decision. She dresses in her 7 divine powers, her crown, her beads, her rod and ring, her breastplate, her garments of radiance. But as she passes through the 7 gates one by one, the gatekeepers strip these powers from her. This ritual undressing is not humiliation, it is disintegration, a symbolic shedding of identity, authority, and ego. Modern psychologists see in this sequence the classic journey through the unconscious, the ego, the social self, the constructed persona, everything that gives a person stability, must be removed before the deeper, hidden self can emerge. By the time Inanna reaches Ereshkigal, she is naked, bowed low, and powerless. The Queen of Heaven is now only herself, stripped of titles, forms, illusions. This moment has fascinated scholars more than any other. Not because Inanna is judged and killed, hung on a hook for 3 days and 3 nights, but because of what happens around her. Ereshkigal, the dark mirror of Inanna, is not a villain. She is grief. She is pain. She is the convulsing, raging force of suffering that cannot be bypassed or dismissed. While Inanna hangs lifeless, Ereshkigal screams, writhes, gives birth to cries that shake the foundations of Kur. She embodies the raw emotional truth the descent forces us to face, the part of the psyche that hurts but cannot be ignored. Many modern readers recognize this instantly. This is trauma. This is depression. This is the breakdown that precedes breakthrough. And then comes one of the most mysterious transformations in ancient literature. Inanna does not resurrect herself. She is resurrected by compassion. The tiny beings created by Enki, creatures made of dirt from beneath his fingernails, descend not with weapons, nor threats, nor magic, but with empathy. They mirror Ereshkigal's cries. They acknowledge her pain without judgment. They validate her suffering. And the goddess of the underworld, who has been unreachable to all others, finally relents and allows Inanna's body to be revived. Modern interpreters see in this a stunning insight. Even the most powerful transformation is not achieved through domination or self-will, but through compassion, often toward the darkest parts of ourselves. When Inanna rises, she is not the same goddess who descended. She is more. She has confronted death, not as an abstract concept, but as an experience. She has integrated shadow and consciousness. She has relinquished her former power to gain a deeper, truer one. Her resurrection demands price and balance, of course. Dumuzi's fate becomes part of the cycle. Life and death alternate. Fertility and barrenness follow their seasonal rhythms. This is no simple triumph. It is equilibrium restored. The myth became so influential in modern thought that it is now studied alongside Persephone's abduction, Osiris's dismemberment, Christ's 3-day entombment, innumerable shamanic initiations across cultures. But Inanna's myth predates nearly all of them. It is one of humanity's oldest templates for psychological transformation. What makes it so enduring is its honesty. Transformation is not gentle. Growth is not painless. Rebirth is not possible without symbolic death. And for the people who lived thousands of years after Sumer fell, who rediscovered these tablets in the ruins of long-forgotten temples, the message remains as clear as it was in 2500 BCE. Sometimes the only way out is through. Sometimes the path to light runs straight through shadow. And sometimes to become whole, we must allow a part of ourselves to die. Inanna's descent is not a myth to be worshipped. It is a myth to be lived. If Inanna's descent represents the death and rebirth of the self, then Dumuzi, the shepherd, the lover, the king, is the one who pays the price for that rebirth. His fate is one of the most haunting, poetic, and psychologically rich stories in ancient literature, a myth that explains not only the rhythms of nature, but the rhythms of human loss. It begins in a moment most narratives would celebrate. Inanna has returned from the underworld. She has been resurrected. The cycle has been restored. The Queen of Heaven is alive, but resurrection always demands an exchange. In the tablets, Inanna rises not alone, but accompanied by the Gala, the terrifying demons of the underworld, silent enforcers of cosmic balance. They have one mission: to take someone in her place. No resurrection is free. Inanna begins searching for a substitute, someone who will take her spot in Ker. And here, the myth takes its sharpest, most unsettling turn. She does not choose an enemy. She does not choose a stranger. She chooses Dumuzi, the man she once loved. Not because she hates him, not because she wants vengeance, but because love itself cannot shield anyone from the cosmic law of exchange. Scholars have debated this moment for decades. Why does Inanna condemn her lover? The tablets say that when she returned, she found Dumuzi seated on her throne, calm, adorned, not mourning. While others tore their hair and beat their chests in grief, Dumuzi had not given himself to lamentation. Was it arrogance? Was it emotional paralysis? Was it denial? Or was it simply the shock of a mortal confronted with divine catastrophe? Whatever the reason, Inanna's gaze seals his fate. The Gala sees him, and what follows is one of the oldest and most emotionally charged chase narratives in human history. Dumuzi flees across the countryside, taking refuge in fields, barns, and sacred spaces, seeking protection from the sun god, the river god, the shepherd clans, even from demons sympathetic to his plight. But no one can fully stop the law of balance. Eventually, the Gala catch him. His cries echo through poems, laments, and ritual songs that were performed annually for over 2,000 years. My sister, my mother, carry my tears to the heavens. Tell Inanna, I go unwillingly into the land that knows no return. These are among the earliest surviving expressions of existential anguish, of a man pleading against an immutable fate. And yet, the myth does not end in simple tragedy. Dumuzi's sister, Inanna, weeps for him with such devotion, such unrelenting sorrow, that even the underworld softens. She offers herself as a substitute for half the year. Through her sacrifice, Dumuzi is not condemned to eternal imprisonment, but becomes a seasonal god, bound to a cycle that mirrors the world around him. Half the year in the underworld, the dry season, barrenness, the heat that scorches crops. Half the year among the living, the fertile season, growth, renewal, abundance. This cycle is not metaphor. It is the foundation of Sumerian cosmology. Every wilted leaf, every cracked field, every dead branch was Dumuzi's absence. Every sprout, every lamb born in spring, every swell of grain was his return. Inanna and Dumuzi's relationship was never purely romantic. It was cosmic symbiosis. Her descent required his suffering. His suffering ensured the rebirth of the land. Their love was not domestic comfort. It was the engine of existence. Modern interpreters see Dumuzi as the archetype of the dying and rising god, a figure found across countless cultures. Osiris in Egypt, Tammuz in Babylon, Adonis in Greece, Persephone in Hellenic myth, even echoes in Christian resurrection symbolism. But Dumuzi is the oldest of them all. His death is not a punishment, it is a metaphysical function, an embodiment of the inescapable truth that life requires loss, that abundance requires sacrifice, that every return demands a departure. And so every year in ancient Mesopotamia, when the summer heat dried the rivers and the crops wilted, women gathered to wail for Dumuzi. Their lamentations were not theatrical displays. They were ritual acts believed to help shepherd the god back to the world of the living. Their cries gave cosmological structure to human grief. Their performance turned sorrow into renewal. Their voices ensured that love, though wounded, would return. The rituals were so powerful, so emotionally resonant, that echoes of them appear in cultures long after Sumer fades. Even the Hebrew Bible references women weeping for Tammuz at the gates of the temple, centuries after the goddess and her lover had vanished from worship. It is difficult to overstate how deeply the myth of Dumuzi shaped human thought. He is the rhythm of time. He is the cost of rebirth. He is the truth that nothing living escapes the cycle. And through him, Inanna, goddess of passion, chaos, fertility, and cosmic order, remains connected to the earth, to the seasons, to the people who depended on her favor. Because no matter how powerful the Queen of Heaven becomes, her story is incomplete without the lover who dies for her return. If Dumuzi shows us the cost of devotion, then Gilgamesh shows us the cost of defiance. Among the countless myths surrounding Inanna, none cuts more sharply into the human condition than the moment a mortal king, a man of flesh and breath, dares to deny the Queen of Heaven. It is a story of pride and power, of seduction and insult, of a goddess who will not be refused and a ruler who refuses to kneel. The tale begins in Uruk, the city Inanna herself claimed as her earthly domain, the shining center of temples, festivals, and royal lineage. Gilgamesh, the semi-divine king, the son of Ninsun, has just returned from a victory that fills the city with celebration. He and Enkidu have slain Humbaba, the monstrous guardian of the cedar forest. They have done what no mortals dared attempt. They have rewritten the boundaries of the possible. Gilgamesh stands at the height of glory, but it is precisely when humans shine brightest that gods take notice. Inanna, called Ishtar in the Akkadian tradition, descends upon him with desire. The tablets describe her approaching with beauty impossible to refuse, adorned with jewels, wearing the light of the heavens, radiating the intoxicating mixture of love and war that defines her nature. She offers Gilgamesh not simply affection or pleasure, but cosmic elevation, a place at her side, wealth beyond mortal imagining, abundance in the fields, triumph in battle, flocks multiplied, kingdoms bent in devotion. To be chosen by Ishtar was to be chosen by destiny itself. But Gilgamesh refuses, not politely, not carefully, not with the trembling caution one might expect from a man declining a goddess. His rejection is sharp, derisive, almost reckless. He does more than say no. He reminds her, publicly, loudly, of every lover she has destroyed. He names Dumuzi and the suffering she decreed for him. He names the lion, the horse, the shepherd, the gardener. Each one loved her. Each one perished. He accuses the goddess of breaking wings, crippling champions, cursing those who serve her. He turns her divine passion into a weapon used against those who dare to embrace it. He exposes her contradictions in a moment meant to humiliate, not negotiate. And in this single act, Gilgamesh commits the one crime mortals were never meant to commit. He strips a goddess of her mystique. The tablets are clear. Inanna's fury is immediate and catastrophic. She ascends to the heavens, crying to Anu and Antu, demanding vengeance. When Anu hesitates, she threatens to unleash the dead upon the living, to tear open the gates of the underworld, to drown creation in chaos. This is not metaphor. In the Mesopotamian worldview, gods could and did shatter the laws of existence when enraged. Faced with his daughter's apocalyptic threat, Anu relents. He gives her the bull of heaven, a celestial force of destruction, a beast whose breath could split the ground, whose steps were earthquakes, whose presence meant famine and death. The bull descends on Uruk. Chaos follows. With each snort, the earth cracks open. With each charge, men are flung into pits of darkness. The city trembles under a cosmic assault. The laws of nature bend under Inanna's wrath. But Gilgamesh and Enkidu are not ordinary mortals. They stand their ground. They confront the beast head-on. In a scene that pulses like a heartbeat of ancient heroism, Enkidu leaps upon the bull, holding its tail, forcing it to stumble just long enough for Gilgamesh to drive a fatal blow into its neck. The bull of heaven falls, and in that moment, victorious, defiant, unbroken, the heroes commit a final act that seals their fate. They take the thigh of the slain bull and hurl it toward Inanna, an insult so unthinkable that even the gods recoil. It is not just disrespect, it is desecration. It is an act that denies the goddess her victory and exposes her vulnerability before the eyes of mortals. What follows is inevitable. The gods convene. The balance has been broken. The bull of heaven has been slain. The queen has been insulted. And so they decree that one hero must die to restore equilibrium. Gilgamesh is the king, too essential, too powerful, too fated. Enkidu, the companion made from clay, the wild man shaped by the gods to challenge Gilgamesh, is chosen. Enkidu's death becomes the turning point of the entire Gilgamesh epic, a moment that forces the king to confront his own mortality. Yet beneath this narrative lies a deeper truth, a psychological truth about the boundaries between divine will and human agency. Gilgamesh defies Inanna not because he despises her, but because he knows the price of divine intimacy. He refuses to become another Dumuzi, another casualty of a goddess whose love oscillates between ecstasy and ruin. He asserts autonomy in a world where autonomy is not permitted. In doing so, he learns the price: loss, grief, and the unraveling of everything he thought unshakable. Inanna, for her part, is not simply vindictive. She is cosmic reciprocity in motion. She enforces the laws that maintain the balance between gods and mortals. Her rage is not merely emotional. It is structural, the reaction of a universe whose order has been disrupted by a mortal's bold refusal. This is the uncomfortable beauty of the myth. Both sides are right, and both sides are punished. It is a reminder that desire, divine or human, comes with consequence, that freedom often demands sacrifice, that standing against power, even when justified, inevitably invites response. Gilgamesh's defiance and Inanna's fury form the heart of a story not about rejection, but about the fragile boundary between the mortal world and the divine, between autonomy and destiny, between courage and catastrophe. And through this tale, Mesopotamian storytellers ask a question that still echoes today. What does it truly cost to claim one's own path when the universe itself seems determined to choose for us? To understand Inanna's power, one must walk not only through her myths, but through the physical world she commanded. Her influence was not confined to tablets and hymns. It lived in stone, in clay, in ritual, in the very architecture of the world's first cities. Nowhere was this more evident than in Uruk, the shining jewel of Sumer, where the house of heaven stood as both sanctuary and empire. From a distance, the Inanna precinct rose above the landscape like a stairway carved for the gods themselves. Travelers approaching Uruk in the 4th millennium BCE would see its monumental terraces shimmering under the sun, its walls adorned with cone mosaics that reflected light like liquid gold. These were not mere buildings. They were statements of cosmic order, bridges between earth and the heavens, and the beating heart of the earliest urban civilization humanity ever created. Within these walls, Inanna's presence was absolute. Her temple complex was vast, a labyrinth of courtyards, storerooms, kitchens, altars, administrative chambers, priestly residences, ceremonial routes, and sacred gardens. Archaeologists excavating the site discovered layers upon layers of construction, each built upon the last, like geological strata marking centuries of devotion. What the surface revealed was only the final chapter of a story written over 3,000 years. At dawn, the temple awoke. Priests and priestesses entered the courtyard with bread, milk, beer, dates, and incense, carrying offerings meant not for metaphor, but for sustenance. Inanna's statue, treated as a living being, was bathed, anointed, perfumed, dressed, and fed daily. To the Sumerians, the goddess did not symbolize life. She was life, and the temple's duty was to maintain her presence so that the city might flourish. But the temple was far more than a religious center. It was an economic machine, possibly the first of its kind. Thousands of clay tablets record its transactions in grain, livestock, wool, silver, labor, loans, land management, and trade. Entire workforces, Farmers, shepherds, weavers, brewers, scribes, singers, administrators were employed under Inanna's authority. The temple fed them, clothed them, and paid them, redistributing wealth across the city. To offer to Inanna was to invest in the prosperity of Uruk. This was not understood as charity nor taxation. It was cosmic reciprocity. Humans gave to the goddess, and she gave fertility to the fields, abundance to the flocks, strength to the armies, and legitimacy to the kings. The boundary between economy and spirituality, so sharply drawn in modern thought, did not exist here. The temple was the city. Inanna's domain was the engine of civilization itself. Within the heart of the complex stood the Giparu, a sacred residence reserved for the high priestess, the Nindingir, Inanna's earthly embodiment. She was not merely a religious figure, she was political authority personified. Often chosen from royal families, the high priestess wielded influence equal to that of kings. She presided over ceremonies, administered temple wealth, composed hymns, and, in the sacred marriage ritual, enacted the union between goddess and ruler that renewed the land each year. From her chambers, hymns in Sumerian were sung into the night, laments, love songs, invocations, and their echoes would drift through the courtyards, carried by warm desert winds that whispered through Uruk's narrow streets. Around them, rituals unfolded in cycles echoing the rhythm of the seasons. Processions wound through the temple, with priestesses dressed in brilliant garments and gala priests chanting in the Emissal dialect, a language reserved for divine voices. Instruments, lyres, harps, drums, resounded through the halls. Fire flickered, shadows danced, and incense curled upward like smoke rising toward the heavens. Outside the sacred walls, farmers depended upon the temple's blessings. Merchants looked to it for protection. Kings sought its approval before leading troops into war. Lovers invoked its power in matters of desire. Every aspect of life, birth, harvest, marriage, trade, death, was tied to Inanna's will. To live in Uruk was to live in her shadow. And yet this immense structure was not static. Its form changed with each era, rebuilt, expanded, restored. Each generation added their own devotion, leaving inscriptions carved in stone, bricks stamped with royal seals, and prayers preserved in clay. Through conquest, drought, rebellion, and shifting dynasties, the temple endured as the spiritual anchor of Mesopotamian identity. But time is the enemy of all monuments. The ruins that survive today are sunlit bones of what once stood. A fragment of walls, a trace of platforms, the faint outline of monumental stairways leading nowhere. Wind-blown sand covers courtyards where offerings once burned. Silence fills rooms once alive with chanting. The goddess who ruled from these heights no longer receives her morning meal. Yet even in ruin, the temple speaks. Its stones whisper the memory of a civilization that believed prosperity was not built solely by human hands, but granted by a queen whose power crossed boundaries of gender, desire, war, and creation. They tell us that Inanna was not merely worshipped. She was woven into the very structure of life, economy, sexuality, and kingship. As the sun sets over the empty plains, its light falls across the eroded terraces of her ancient home, and for a moment you can almost hear the echo of hymns rising again, as if the Queen of Heaven still lingers, watching over the remnants of the world she helped shape. And with the temple explored, one final transformation remains: the evolution of Inanna into Ishtar, Astarte, Aphrodite, a goddess reborn across cultures and centuries, carried by memory itself. When we reach the final arc of Inanna's story, we are no longer speaking of a single goddess, a single city, or even a single civilization. We are speaking of a force, one that traveled through languages, borders, empires, and epochs, reshaping itself with every culture it touched. By the time the last temple closed, Inanna had already become something far more enduring than a deity worshipped in the dust of Mesopotamia. She had transformed into an archetype woven into the fabric of human memory. The process began quietly, centuries before her final hymns were sung. As Sumer gave way to Akkad, and Akkad gave way to Babylon and Assyria, her identity began to merge, shift, and evolve. The Sumerian Inanna, fierce and radiant, fluid and unpredictable, became Ishtar in Akkadian tongues, a goddess whose name resonated from the banks of the Euphrates to the gates of Nineveh. In the myths, she wielded bow and blade, conquered mountains, and shattered armies. In the hearts of her followers, she became the embodiment of imperial destiny. Her worship expanded. Kings carried her standards into battle. Generals sought visions from her priestesses before daring to march. Cities adopted her as patroness, protector, and divine sovereign. Her star, the eight-pointed symbol of Venus, appeared on seals, on helmets, on walls, on clay tablets, and on the very bricks of palaces. It was a sign of favor, a sign of legitimacy, a sign of power that no rival deity could eclipse. But the transformation did not stop at Mesopotamia's borders. Through trade, migration, and political contact, Ishtar's influence crossed into the Levant, becoming Astarte, goddess of fertility, desire, and sacred sexuality. She was adopted into Canaanite traditions, then into Phoenician prayers that spread to Mediterranean shores. Ships carried her to Cyprus and Carthage. Merchants invoked her name in distant ports. And in Greek lands, fragments of her myths blended with local lore, contributing to the shaping of Aphrodite, whose earliest cult centers bear unmistakable echoes of Inanna's ancient rites. Across these transitions, her character remained remarkably consistent. She was always the paradoxical goddess, love and war, fertility and death, beauty and terror. The Greeks softened her edges, the Phoenicians emphasized her sensuality, the Assyrians glorified her as the supreme force of battle, but beneath each adaptation, the same ancient pulse remained. Yet no civilization endures forever. As the first millennium of the Common Era unfolded, the world shifted. Monotheistic religions rose with zealous certainty. Polytheism declined under political, social, and theological pressure. Temples were abandoned. Priests disappeared. Festivals faded. By the 6th century CE, the last unmistakable traces of her worship slipped quietly into silence. But silence is not absence, and disappearance is not death. Inanna survived, just not in the way her ancient followers imagined. She lived on in the clay tablets buried beneath ruins that empires forgot. She lived on in stories copied by scribes who never knew her hymns were among humanity's oldest works of literature. She lived on in the echoes of archetypes that reemerged again and again in myths of descent, resurrection, sacred union, erotic power, and the luminous terror of divine femininity. When modern archaeologists uncovered the tablets in the 19th century, they found not a forgotten goddess, but a force waiting to be rediscovered. Her voice rose again as scholars deciphered cuneiform signs and uncovered the emotional richness of her myths. Students of comparative religion traced her journey through cultures. Feminist thinkers recognized in her a figure of autonomy, sexuality, and strength, long suppressed by later traditions. Psychologists saw in her descent a blueprint for the dark night of the soul. Artists, writers, and musicians found in her an inexhaustible source of imagery and inspiration. She had become immortal in a way no temple ritual could have ensured. And perhaps this was always the true destiny of the Queen of Heaven, not to rule a single city, nor to preside over a single pantheon, but to endure across the millennia as a symbol of human complexity, of our desire, our rage, our creativity, our contradictions, our longing for transformation. When we study Inanna now, we are not merely looking at an ancient goddess. We are looking at the origins of civilization's imagination. We are looking at a mirror held up to the earliest human attempts to understand power, love, death, renewal, and the great mysteries that shape existence. We are looking at the blueprint of the divine feminine before the world shifted toward patriarchal order. Her temples may be ruins, her priestesses may be long gone, her hymns may echo only in academic translations and whispered interpretations. But Inanna persists in every story of descent and rebirth, in every fierce goddess of modern literature, in every exploration of gender fluidity, in every depiction of love intertwined with danger, in every mythic narrative that refuses simplification. That is her true legacy. Not the stones of Uruk, not the rituals recorded in clay, not the offerings made at dawn, but the transformation she continues to inspire thousands of years after her last shrine crumbled. In the end, the Queen of Heaven achieved the one thing even gods rarely secure: immortality through memory. Not worship, not sacrifice, not fear, but remembrance. And as long as humans continue to study the past, question the unknown, and search for meaning in the oldest stories ever written, Inanna will never truly be gone. She will always descend. She will always rise. She will always return. For that is the nature of the goddess who walked willingly into the darkness and emerged brighter than the morning star itself.